Okay, welcome back to the Excel project. So right now what we're going to do is we're going to go over what we discussed last time with the purchase journal, and then we're going to finish up the purchase journal and look at recording the macro. And then we will go into the sales journal and assign the first homework assignment. So as a recap first, what we're going to do is we're going to open up the document. So hopefully you have your saved document from last night you've been working on. You're going to open that up. Mine's called Book 1. And so I just want you to see the proper way to open that up. And so right now there's no macros, but when there is a macro, what's going to happen is there's going to be a big bar right here, and it's going to say options on it. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you by opening up the example that I might refer to throughout these lectures. So this is the bar that I'm talking about that comes up, and it says it's a security warning. Macros have been disabled. So that means that the macros, this video that we're recording, has been disabled. So in other words, unless I enable them, these macros will not work, and therefore your project will not work. The reason that Microsoft has this warning that comes up is because macros is a very basic, easy form to create bad things with computers like viruses and things like that. You could create a macro that once it starts running, it's instructed to go to your documents and delete all your documents after I click on this hyperlink that was sent through an email or something like that. And so very simple way to go about doing that. No one probably really uses them to that degree anymore. It's very amateur, I would say, but nonetheless, that's the reason behind having this security warning, is that Microsoft Office wants you to be sure that you trust the content of these macros before you open them up. So you would click on options and you're going to get this window to come up, and you're just going to select enable this content and then click OK. And then you notice the bar goes away that was up here, and now your macro should work. And so that's going to be the first step whenever you open up your project from now on. And if you notice up here, it's saved as an XLSM document. The M stands for macro. It's a macro-enabled document. And so up here right now in our document that we've been doing in class, it's only an XLSX, and the X just stands for the 2007 Microsoft version of Office. So that is kind of the rundown on that. So last time what we did is we made our purchase journal, and so we only worked on one sheet, and so we had our PO number, which is just the transaction number for our purchase, the date that it occurred, the vendor, the product, the quantity of those products we purchased, the unit cost for one product, and then the total cost for that transaction. We have our PO number working based on this number here. This is kind of our source of our PO number, and every other PO number above that is just going to build off the previous one. So right now this 1001 is building off the previous PO number, and as you'll see when we start recording the macro, then PO number 1002 will just build off of the number 1001. So up here to the top, we have all of our information that basically is going to make our project work. And so we have our vendors, we have our products, we have the unit cost, and then we have this quantity cap. And so I want to review that really quick. We're assuming that we can't purchase more than a certain amount in a given transaction. You know, we said if I'm going to be buying airplanes, it makes no sense to be able to buy 50 airplanes in a transaction. Who's going to have 50 Boeing 747s? But if I'm buying packets of shoelaces, buying 50 packets of shoelaces makes perfect sense. So we have selected that cell. We've gone to our data tab. We have gone over to data validation. And then we've typed in this formula, and basically the formula here in the data validation is saying that whatever number I put in to this quantity cell, it has to be a whole number. In other words, it can't be a 1.5, it has to be a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or so forth. And that number has to be less than or equal to some maximum. And basically think of this VLOOKUP equation as a number itself. And so basically what we're saying is I'm looking at the product G11 And then I'm looking at some range, N2 to P5. So I started with my products and I've gone over to the quantity cap. And so whenever I have a range in the VLOOKUP, my range has to always start with whatever it is I'm comparing. So I'm comparing G11, the product, to these products over here. So that's why my range starts with the product column. And then I'm using the information in the third column in my table array, which is NOP. P is the third column in that range. And then we are typing false. We always want an exact match. And so that's kind of the typical rundown on that. So you can just click OK to get rid of that. And so hopefully now that I have hats, we can see that I can't buy any more than 55. So if I type in 55, it should work. If I type in 56, it should stop me. And that's exactly what we want to see. And so you're going to also have a control very similar to that on the sales journal. Okay. So then lastly, over here, we're keeping track of our inventory. It's kind of a tally for our inventory of what we're being sold, or what's being purchased. And so we're going to start first by naming these last two products. If you haven't already made up your own products and your own vendors and whatnot, we're going to change those right now. And so I'm going to call this pants, and I'm going to call this shirt. Okay, and you notice that when I change pants and shirt, or 3 and 4 to pants and shirt, the pants and shirt also changed here. And that's again just because this cell is directly referencing that cell. So, you know, O10 is referencing N4. And that's going to be also changed in the drop-down list for the product. Pants and shirt are now there instead of 3 and 4, because this data validation for our drop-down list is just basically selecting this range of information. And if this information changes, the information in our drop-down list will change as well. So that's what we're doing there. Okay. So now what we need to do is we need to track our inventory. We need to make sure that we're going to keep track of our purchases. So what we're going to do is we're going to start what's called an if equation. Hopefully that rings some bells from a previous class. So we're going to start out equals if, open parenthesis, and the first thing you have in an if equation is a logical test. And so it could be, you know, this cell has to be greater than this cell, or equal to this cell, or it has to be less than this cell. So really, you can do a lot with an if equation. We're going to keep it pretty basic though, and we're going to say if the product in the product cell, G11, equals this title, this product here, because this is the tally for the hats. So if I purchase a hat, whatever quantity I have for hat, I want it to show up here, and I don't want it to show up over here. And so we're going to keep a tally for the hats. So if the product here equals hats, and we're going to absolute reference M10, because we're always going to be looking at this cell. This cell is never going to move. These rows here, this row is never going to move. When we insert a row for a macro, we're going to push down row 11. But row 10, the headings, they will stay exactly where they are. And so that means that these formulas will also get pushed down. And remember we said, unless you absolute reference certain information, when the formulas get pushed down, all the cells in the formula also get pushed down. So this will turn into G12. And this would turn into M11 if we didn't absolute reference it. But we always want to look at M10, so that's why we're going to absolute reference that. So we're going to say if these products equal, if G11 equals M10, so this is true. Notice it says value if true. If this value is true, if these two things do in fact equal, we want to see what's the quantity. How many units did we buy? And if it's false, say for instance I have shoe, pants, or shirt selected here that does not equal hat, then I just want to display a 0 because I bought 0 units of hats. If I bought shoes here, I obviously don't have any hats here, so I would have a 0 for hats. And then we're just going to close off that parenthesis. And so you can do that by keying down, hitting enter, or closing the parenthesis. And so we need to do this for each product. And so we're going to do it for the next one. Again, I'm just going to say if And if the product in the product cell now equals shoes, absolute reference, then tell me how many did I buy, and if they don't equal, then just tell me 0. Okay, and so I bought no shoes. Shoes is not here. So shoe and hat do not equal, so that's 0. I obviously bought 0 shoes in this transaction. I bought hats, which is why the number's showing up for hats and not shoes. So hopefully for pants and shirt, we will also see zeros. Okay. And then the last one, again, we're going to say the products, if they equal, absolute reference, tell us the quantity, and if they don't equal, tell us 0. Okay, so now we've got our tally, and you can see if I change this to shoe, the 55 has moved from hat to shoe now, because the shoes equal, and you just want to check that and make sure it's working for all of them. Pants, and notice that I got this pound sign here now. There's no error here. All this is saying is that there's not enough room, there's not enough width in this column to see the number, and so there's 2 ways to fix that. You can either double click in between the J and K, and it'll open everything up. Or if you want to have the proper spacing for everything, some people might kind of fiddle with this and change things like that, and that can get kind of tedious and time consuming. If you click up here in this corner, it's going to highlight your spreadsheet indefinitely, and then you can double click in between any column you want, and it's going to space everything in your spreadsheet perfectly. And so if you don't want to go through one by one, that's the quick fix right there to do that. So now I got my total cost. I can change pants now to shirt, and again I got 55 over there. All right. So let's put that back to hat the way it was. So now we said this is our tally, so we need to keep track of the totals. We're obviously going to start having more transactions. I want to know out of all the transactions, how many hats did I purchase, shoes, pants, shirts, etc. So we're going to say equals sum. I want to sum up these columns. And so I need to start with the heading. And then we're going to select also the first row, our first tally row, close off the parenthesis and click enter. The reason we're including the heading is because when I insert a row here, it's going to push everything down. If I only select this area here and I push this down, it's not going to incorporate the new information. And so we can demonstrate that right now. If I get rid of this, let's see, M11. If I just sum up M11 and click enter, then if I insert a row, which is what our macro is going to do, this sum now only is summing up M12, and it's not going to incorporate the information in the new row M11. However, if we undo this, and I in fact change this to incorporate the heading, now basically this range that I have here is going to get split. It's going to widen, all right? We're going to put a space in between it. So now it's summing up, instead of M10 to M11, it's summing up M10 to M12. And so it's going to include this new row. And so that's what we want. That's why we are including the title. And so we're going to also have a sum down here for the total cost. I want to know how much have I spent overall over the course of the year. And again, we're going to include the title and that as well, okay? And you want to make sure that you make the monetary numerical cells monetary. You want to format them so that they're monetary. So we're going to click this $sign, but we're not going to make these $signs because we're talking units here, not a monetary value. All right, and so you can just drag this sum equation across. Generally in this project you cannot drag equations across. You can drag them up and down, but with a sum, that's the one equation that you really can drag across. So you can click in the bottom right hand corner so that your cursor goes from a fat white cross to a skinny black cross. you can left click, hold down, and drag across, and it'll copy that formula over. And so now all of these are summing up the right information. Okay? So basically what we're ready now to do is we're ready to record our macro. We've got our whole table set up. It's ready to go. Notice the date. It says 7/13. It has the date from when we last did this. It doesn't have today's date. Okay? So before we record our macro, I want to title this spreadsheet. I want to title it Purchase Journal. You can also call it PJ, whatever you want. So I just want to notice that this is my purchase journal. And the reason I need to title it before I run the macro is that the macro is going to say we're going to update stuff on PJ, on spreadsheet PJ. And so if I hadn't changed that, it would say we're going to update information on sheet 1. And then once I rename the sheet, it's going to look for sheet 1, which is no longer called sheet 1. It's now called PJ. And the macro is going to get confused, and it's going to say that there's a bug in it. And so we don't want that. So we want to make sure that we title our spreadsheet properly so that our macro works. Okay. So quick conceptual recap on the macro. The macro is a recording of all your movements. And so the nice thing with the macro is that even if you mess up while you're recording, as long as you catch it while you're recording, you can fix it. Because all we're concerned about with the macro really is the end result. Have we gone through all the proper steps, and is the end result the way we want it? And so what we're going to do is we're going to go to the View tab, and we're going to say macros. We're going to select this drop down, and we're going to say record macros. And then up here you need a name. And so I would suggest naming the macros according to what journal they're for. So this is for the purchase journal. So I'm just going to call this PJ. Okay, you can't have any spacings in the name, so you can have characters though, dashes and periods. So if you want to say purchase dot journal, that's fine too, or something to that extent. But you can't have spacings in the macro name. And so there's nothing else we need to do here. This macro is going to be stored in this workbook. We can leave that alone. We're just going to click OK. All right. So now we're recording. So everything that I'm doing now, it's recording. So when I replay that movie, it's going to do all this over again, but it's going to basically do it at light speed. You're not going to even really see it happen that much. You will see some movements in your macro, and if you want to, for phase 2, for some extra points for those added controls, there's a little line of text you can put into your macro to get rid of that movement. And so you can Excel help that, or Google that information and find that out. But really, it's kind of fun to watch that, the macro update and change everything, especially if you have 4 or 5 pages updating at once and they're all different colors. It looks like a light show in front of you almost. So to each his own, I guess. All right, so back to the work. We're going to start going through the steps for our macro for our purchase journal. So the first thing we want to do is we want to insert a new row. So we're going to right click on the 11 and click insert. Okay, so now I have a brand new row. This is going to be for my new transaction. Okay, so we're basically creating a row for a new transaction. And so we're going to copy and paste everything up from the previous cell. We're just going to copy and paste up the formulas though, however. We're not copying and pasting the actual content. I'm not copying and pasting 1001. I'm copying and pasting the formula equals D13 plus 1. And when I copy it up, it's going to change to equals D12 plus 1. So I'm going to say Control C. You can also right click and say copy. I find the Control C for Control Copy and Control V for paste is a lot quicker. So I'm going to go up to this cell and then say Control V. And so now I have PO 1002. And you notice the formula updated, it changed. And so again, going back to the absolute referencing of our table array or certain information, that's why we absolute reference it, so that formula doesn't change. That certain cell we're referencing doesn't change. However, in these cases, we do want them to change. We want them to update, so we're not going to absolute reference these cells here. Okay, so the only formula you have to retype in the macro is the equals today formula, and that's because we want this to show today's date. I simply can't copy and paste up 7-13 because today is not the 13th. So let's see what today's date is. Okay, 20th. And you notice that this is bolded. That might happen sometimes. So you can just go to your home tab while you're recording and you can unbold it. So that way everything looks the same. So in my formula bar, it still says equals today. I want this to say the date, not the formula. So I'm going to Control C, copy that information, and I'm going to paste the value back into the cell. And you notice that the formula went away, and now I have the date up in the formula bar. Alright, so now I can select the next cell. I'm just going to say Control Copy, Control Paste, Control Copy, Control Paste, and I'm going to say Control Copy, Control Paste for all of this. Alright, and right now this information is the same for these because I'm copying and pasting up the data validations and the formulas, but since I copied up this data validation, it also copied up the content, which means that these formulas are just referencing these cells now. So that's why this is all the same. Don't be alarmed. That's okay for right now. I'm also going to copy and paste up these cells off to the side, my tallies for my inventory, and you notice that my inventory here, sum total updated for hats because it's incorporating that new row. Okay, so now we need to delete some information. And basically the rule of thumb is that if I select a cell and I can see a formula there, I do not want to delete it. Okay, I repeat, do not delete those cells. If you delete those cells, you are deleting the formulas and they will no longer work. Cells, however, that have a data validation, you can delete because you're only deleting what you selected. You're not going to actually delete the data validation itself. The data validation is kind of behind the curtain, so to speak, and you can't really delete it unless you physically go through and remove the data validation, which can be done by going back to the data tab, selecting the cell first, going to the data tab, and then clearing the data validation contents for that cell. So don't be worried about deleting the data validation for these cells. I'm going to delete the quantity. I'm going to delete the product. I'm also going to delete the vendor. Okay, and so the reason I'm doing that is because in the new transaction, I may buy from a different person, I may buy different products, and I may buy a different quantity. So I want those to be blank, ready for the new user to fill in when they start recording a new transaction. And so you want to just double check and make sure you got everything copied and pasted up, that your date is correct and that it has the actual date and not the formula in the formula bar, that the vendor, product, and quantity are blank. And so if you're copying and pasting up blank cells, you still need to go through the physical process of deleting these cells. And you just simply click delete. Delete, delete. If you don't do that, then when you run the macro, say there is information below, it's going to copy and paste up the information and it won't remove it. So, if these cells were blank and I copied and pasted them up, then these cells would also be blank. But I still need to go through and delete it because if I don't, then next time, say when this row has information in it, the macro is going to copy and paste up that information up to the new row and it won't remove it. And so when the macro's done recording, I'm going to have a new transaction already filled in because I didn't go through those deleting steps. And we don't want that. We want this row to be blank, ready to fill in for the new user. Okay? All right, and so we got this information here copied and pasted up. We got these pound NAs. We're going to deal with those after we're done recording the macro. Everything here is looking pretty good. We're going to select the vendor cell just because this is the first thing that we're going to fill in. And so that's where we're going to leave our macro. And like I said, I can type a bunch of stuff here, and that's okay. As long as I go through and delete it, and my end result is the way I want it, that's what we're concerned with, because the macro is going to type that gibberish up here every single time now, but it's also going to delete it. So at the end of the macro, it's not going to be there. It's not going to cause any problems. So Obviously, you want to avoid doing that kind of stuff, but the concept there is if you do make a mistake, say you copy and paste up the wrong cell, or you copy and paste it up too far, or you accidentally delete a formula here, you can also click undo while recording the macro, and that's fine as well. So if you think you did some steps wrong or whatnot, then that's okay. You can click undo. You can't, however, undo a macro once it's been recorded, and I will show you that in just a second. So, okay, leaving the cursor at the vendor cell, we are all done recording. We're going to go back to the View tab, over the macros, and say Stop Recording. So now we need to assign this macro to a shape. We need to basically make a play button for our movie that we just recorded. And so I'm going to select just a random shape, and you can drag that shape out. I'm going to right click on the shape, and then down here it says Assign Macro. I'm going to click on that. And notice here it says all open workbooks. Right now this isn't a problem because this is the only workbook I have open. But say for example you have the class example open and you have yours open, it's going to show you the macros for everything. And you can't cross assign macros. So you can't assign a macro from one workbook to another. If you're assigning a macro to workbook A, that macro had to be recorded in workbook A. It could not be recorded in workbook B. So if it was recorded in workbook B, you can't assign it to workbook A. So we're going to go down here and say this workbook. I just want to see macros in this workbook. And then we're going to click OK. And so I've assigned that macro to this cell right here, to this shape, excuse me, right here. And so if you want to, you can edit the text of it. And you can say new purchase. That way we know what this shape is doing. I'm going to click off to the side, and that's going to get rid of that edit box around it. And now you notice when I put my cursor over this shape, I have that little hand. So I click the hand, and here's our problem, okay? So this means that I didn't save this shape as a macro-enabled workbook. So this was done intentionally to show you that you need to save this as a macro-enabled workbook. If you don't, your macros won't work. So I need to go over here to Save As and Save as a macro-enabled workbook. I'm going to save it to this USB, and notice now it's changed from XLSX to XLSM. I'm going to click Save, and then I need to close this. I need to go down here and open up Book 1 XLSM. And remember, the first step is to always enable macros. And I'm pretty sure this macro will not work. Alright, so which means we need to go back through and re-record it. So we're doing this for practice. So what I want you to do is I want you to cut the shape. I want you to get rid of it. I want you to learn how to do this, because trust me, you're going to be re-recording the macro a lot. And you're also going to have these mistakes. And so you need to know how to fix these mistakes. So we're going to delete that shape. You have to delete the shape. We're going to go back. Excuse me. We're going to go back to the View tab. We're going to select Macros. We're going to select Record Macros. We're going to give the macro a name. If you want to give it the same name, PJ, you can. And it's just going to ask if you want to overwrite that. And so we're going to say, yes, I want to replace it. I'm now recording. We're going to quickly go through the steps. Going to say Insert. I'm going to copy and paste everything up except for the date. Even these blank cells, I got to copy and paste up. Okay. And that's just being done by Control-C, Control-V. I can go over here and do the date again, equals today, open close parenthesis. I'm going to go to my Home tab, unbold. I'm going to say copy, paste value, and then I need to go through and delete these cells. Even though there's nothing in them, I need to go through the motions of deleting. So I select the cell, click delete, select product, click delete, select quantity, click delete. And I'm only going to do that in the top row, okay? I'm only doing that in the new row that I'm creating. I'm not going to do that in these bottom rows because these bottom rows generally will be filled in, and if I delete them, I'm basically deleting history. And I don't want to delete history, okay? So I'm only going to delete the contents in these top rows. So now I leave the cursor at vendor. I'm going to go back to the view tab, and I'm going to select the macros, stop recording macros. I'm going to go back to my insert tab, select the shape, select the same shape or a new shape, whatever you want. It needs to be a new shape, but you can select a different style of shape. It's probably more clear. Right click on the shape, assign macro, click on the macro you want, purchase journal, click OK, and then let's run it. And now it works. And the reason it works is because our workbook is an XLSM, and you have to record the macro after the fact. It has to be an XLSM. It needs to be a macro-enabled workbook. Again, you do that by going over here to the little file button, save as, and then macro enabled. After you save it once initially as a macro enabled workbook, then you can click the save button up here and it'll always update and save what you've done. You don't need to go to this area here and save as a macro enabled workbook every single time. You just need to do that initially to basically create the type of workbook or file that this is. Okay, so I'm going to edit the text, call it new purchase, click off to the side. I'm going to fill this all out and just kind of randomly plop in some information. Okay, let's check. I got 10 of hat and 55 of hat, total of 65, 12 of shoe, 15 of pants, and no shirts. Okay, that looks pretty good. Notice that if I get rid of some of this information though, that error that came back up, since that error is there, now my total is also messed up. And so once we start referencing pages back and forth, that's going to be a problem. So we're going to fix these. And one concern people have is that, well, I've already recorded my macro, and so my macro copied and pasted those formulas up. I got to change the formulas. Do I have to re-record the macro? And the answer is no. The macro is not copying and pasting up the formula per se. It's just copying and pasting up the information in that cell. And so if that information changes, that's okay. It's going to copy and paste up the new information. So it's not going to be copying and pasting up shoe, or the data validation that only has hat, shoe, pants, shirt in it. Okay, it's copying up a data validation that has selected this range of information. If I change the content in that range of information, that's okay. Same thing with these formulas. It's just said whatever formula is in this cell, bring it up to that cell. It's not saying bring up equals VLOOKUP G11 and then your range and 2 and false up to this cell. It's just saying whatever is in this cell, whatever the content is, bring it up. And so if the content changes, that's okay. So we're going to put what's called an if equation in front of here. And so we're just going to click in between the equal sign and VLOOKUP and put in an if, open parenthesis. And what we're going to do is we're going to say if the product equals, and we're going to say double quotation mark. Double quotation mark stands for nothing. And so you can't say 0 because 0 is something, nothing is nothing. It's kind of a brain teaser there. So 0 is something and nothing is nothing. Okay, so I'm going to say if the product equals nothing, And we're doing this in the unit cost cell. And the reason we're selecting the product is because the unit cost is based on the product, okay? The unit cost is not based on the vendor or the quantity. Each product has its own specific unit cost. So the unit cost is based on the product. So that's why we're saying if the product equals nothing, then I want that cell, the unit cost cell, to do nothing. So if the value is true, do nothing. If the value is false, in other words, if I do have a product in here, then I want you to do this VLOOKUP equation, okay? And we're going to put one more closing parenthesis outside, kind of like our algebra. We got to make sure our parentheses match. And then we're just going to click enter. And you notice that that pound error is gone now. And so what this is called, this part right here is called error covering. When we do this, we're going to cover up those errors. So you notice in the syllabus on the purchase journal and sales journal, you need to have error covering, which means you need to have these equals if equations in front of the VLOOKUPs so that we don't see these errors. Because if you don't get rid of those errors, then you're going to get errors down here, and that's going to cause you some problems in the future. Okay, so we need to go through here and do the exact same thing. So I'm going to say, but we don't need another equal sign. So equals if. And then here we can say the quantity, since I may select a product and then the unit cost will come up, but the total cost is not going to come up until I select a quantity. And so you got to kind of think about what cell am I going to reference. So we're going to say quantity, and one hint generally is whatever the first cell is in the original equation or in the original VLOOKUP, that's generally the cell that you're going to reference. So before it was G11, which was the product. Now in this case it's H11, the quantity. So if H11 equals nothing, in other words, if I haven't selected a quantity yet, then I want the total cost to do nothing. If I have, however, selected a quantity, then I want it to do this multiplication, and I want to then close the parenthesis. Okay, so now that cell is blank, which is the way I want it. I select product, let's say shirt. My unit cost comes up, but my total cost does not because I have not selected a quantity yet. I put in a quantity, now my unit cost comes up. And so these other formulas down below do not have that error covering in front of it. They need to. So I can select this top cell here, this unit cost, which does have the error covering, select the bottom right hand corner, and just drag this down. All right, you're just copying and pasting it down. Now all these have that error covering in front of it. Do the same thing for the total cost. Just drag it down. Now all these have the error covering in front of it. So our macro should still be okay. I'm going to run the macro again. Notice that everything's blank. I can select these cells and notice that the if equation's in front of there, okay? The macro is still okay, and my new formulas are up there because all the macro was saying was whatever information is in here, bring it on up. All right? I'm going to save this information after I fill it all out. Okay. We're going to go up here, click Save, and notice that if I run the macro one more time, this undo button goes away. And that's what I mean by you can't undo a macro. I said that earlier. You can undo while recording the macro, but you cannot undo a macro that has been run, okay? So I cannot undo this right here. I can, however, right-click and delete. You want to be very, very careful when you do that, though. I can only delete the top row. I cannot delete the middle row because these formulas are building off each other. If I break that chain, if I delete one of the rows in the middle somewhere, then it's going to throw everything else off. So I got to make sure if I ever delete a row, I'm only going to delete the top row. Okay, if I delete one row in the middle somewhere, it's going to break the chain. You're going to have some problems. Okay, so save that, close it, and we are done for right now. We are going to come back in a little bit and do our sales journal.